Hi there, how's it going? New video today about photogrammetry. Today I'm going to use the Mini 3 Pro from DJI to do a 3D scan of this building right there. It's an old barn. It seems to be unused right now, so it's probably not going to bother anyone if I fly around. And I'm going to show you quickly the process, and then we're going to mostly compare the results of different softwares using the same set of images. So let's go. So here we are, starting the photogrammetry process by going into the settings and then starting with an orbit relatively far away just to get a general overview of the building. Then I'm doing 2 passes with an oblique angle, 45 degrees more or less. Now doing the inside of the roof. This is a particularity of the DJI Mini 3 Pro. You can aim the camera super high up, very convenient for these cases. Then I'm doing the back wall with oblique angles, 45 degrees every time. Then the other side of the roof, 45 degrees but the other way around, and 90 degrees to that. Then I'm starting to do the outside but more precisely, doing the walls. Here I had to do it again because the exposure was all wrong. And then I get a little closer to capture a bit more detail. And on that face, I'm going even closer, doing some wiggly lines up and down and up and down. And then do not forget the overhangs. Take a picture aiming up so that you can get these overhangs. Now at that point I was running out of battery, so I had to swap it. And I just resumed my capturing process from where I left off. Here this shot is kind of hard because the sun was hitting the sensor directly, so quality is not the best. And here I wanted to capture a bit more of the inside of the barn, the ground as well. Here an oblique shot with the pillars. And here I thought that this little detail with the 2 planks was kind of looking nice, so I just got closer in order to capture it. So this is the result given by 3DF Zephyr. First thing that we notice is that there are holes in the roof. It's especially visible in the shadow of the roof. You can see some light goes through. So this part has a few artifacts. First thing that we notice is that the colors are completely off. Now this is due to the way it was shot. It kind of looks the same on every single software. So this is not really the software's fault. The sun was hitting the sensor of the drone directly and it just caused massive flares. So this is why it looks so bad. But overall, the shape of the roof has been reconstructed relatively well given the conditions of the shoot. The back wall of the barn is both amazing and disappointing. So the texture is really sharp and full of details, except in the middle where it didn't align some of the cameras that were closer to the wall, and it really shows that the quality is much lower at that particular spot. This face of the building overall looks pretty good in my opinion, especially because of the textures. The textures are very sharp and the overhang is well reconstructed. It's overall pretty good. Look at the nice texture on the beams here. Very well reconstructed. Now this is one of the best parts of the mesh because I took so many photos close up to the wall. So the texture is good, the geometry is good. I think this is the best reconstructed place of the entire building with 3DF Zephyr. Now the pillar is a bit wobbly and the texture is quite bad. This is because I didn't take any close-ups of that particular part. So on all softwares it looks kind of bad, but this one actually sorts it out because at least the pillar is monolithic. Now let's take a closer look to the more challenging part of that building, which was the inside of the roof. Here you could see that all the beams have been relatively well constructed and the texture is relatively seamless in terms of color. The colors kind of shift from one side to the next. It starts a bit greenish and it ends up more orange, and the real color was more, orangey brown. So there is a bit of a gradient here, but globally it looks pretty detailed and very nice. Now onto the planks, the little detail here. It did reconstruct it relatively well. At least it understood that the two planks were separate objects, which is not always a given. On the roof, besides the missing tiles and the little holes, it's okay, I would say. I didn't take any close-up shots here. Once again, it was more of a wide shots, and also part of the cameras did not align properly, so we only have about half the information about the roof as we actually captured with the drone. And as a result, the mesh doesn't look as accurate and the texture is not as precise. Now for the rest of the interior of the barn, we could see the left wall is a bit wobbly. This is probably because I took fewer pictures over there, but the rest of the back wall inside is relatively well reconstructed. Once again, good geometry and good texture. So the conclusion for 3ds Zephyr, in my opinion, for that particular scene is that it did relatively well, although it failed to align some of the cameras, which in turn lowered the quality of most notably the roof and also the back wall's texture on the outside. But overall the texture looks relatively sharp with a lot of detail, and this again is with the default settings. I didn't touch anything else, I just clicked next with all the default settings. So this is the type of mesh and result that you can get out of 3ds Zephyr with the default settings. Onto Metashape. So right off the bat, the first difference that we notice is that the roof doesn't have any holes, so that's a good sign compared to 3ds Zephyr. We also notice that overall the mesh is a bit more round and with less noise on it. This is because the filtering by default in Metashape is a bit more aggressive than in 3ds Zephyr. Now of course this part is not super well reconstructed because it was in the shadows and the sun was hitting the sensor, so in all softwares it didn't really look good. Now the back wall here looks very nice. The texture is relatively detailed and quite sharp, although slightly less than on 3ds Zephyr. Here this facade reconstructed the overhang relatively well. You can see that the beams are correctly represented and they don't have any noise on them or any weird shapes sticking out. This is the most detailed part of the mesh, and here you could see that it's very round and filtered, and the texture here is not as good as on 3ds Zephyr, even though all the photos were taken very close to the wall. Here of course the sign is barely readable. This is actually the better one. You can almost make out what it says. And the roof, the inside of the roof is relatively well reconstructed. All the beams are present. There's no holes anywhere in the roof, both inside and outside, and all the beams look pretty good. I'd say it did very well in this one. However, the little detail with the planks at the rear of the barn is not as well reconstructed. You can see that there's a little blob joining the two planks, so that's not great. Here's a close-up of the roof. Not much to say except that there are no holes, so that's a good thing again. And the shape of the tiles is relatively well reconstructed. And the inside of the barn looks pretty good. It's pretty uniform overall, both in terms of geometry and texture. So I think Metashape did really well. I think that overall is the mesh that looks the best from all angles. Sure, it's not perfect, but overall I do prefer the way it looks. I would love to see a bit more detail in the textures, but this of course is the default setting and it can be tweaked, and textures with a higher resolution can be generated by the software without any problems. Now, for the third commercial program that we're testing in this video, reality capture. Now, one quick note, it generated over 70 million faces, and when it has more than 40 million faces, it actually refuses to display the full mesh. So I had to downsample it within reality capture to display a 20 million faces mesh. So this is what you're seeing here. So this part, just like the two previous softwares, has a completely different color than the rest of the mesh, again because of the way the pictures were taken, not because of the software. It did its best, and the leftmost part is a bit messy, but the rest of it is better, just like in the previous two examples. Here the back wall looks pretty good. All the pictures that were on this side have been aligned correctly, so there's no gap as we could see on 3ds Zephyr, so that's a good point for reality capture. This face of the building I think looks very nice because it's very even, the quality is homogeneous and uniform everywhere, and the overhangs are pretty well reconstructed. Overall, it's pretty good. I'd say it's on the same level as Metashape, maybe a little better in terms of texturing. So this part of the building, once again, is the most detailed one because this is where I took the most photos from the closest position. I don't think it looks as good as what 3ds Zephyr produced, but it definitely looks sharper and more detailed than what Metashape produced. However, you can see that the pillar is completely messed up. There is a huge piece that is sticking out of the pillar that didn't exist in real life. Here for the underside of the roof, I think it's pretty well constructed overall, just like the other two softwares. It's pretty detailed and it did a relatively good job at making a gradient of the color. So you could see it starts from kind of grayish and then it moves towards warmer colors, but in a relatively smooth way. So that's at least coherent and looks better on the finished product. Now the two planks that are standing here against the wall, I think that Reality Capture did the best job reconstructing this part, better than any other software tested here. It looks relatively sharp, the geometry is good, the separation between the two planks is good, separation between the planks and the back wall is good. It did a very good job here. Now the roof, I think, has more 3D detail than what Metashape did or 3ds Zephyr did. So once again, Reality Capture here managed to do better, but also keep in mind that it generated over 70 million triangles compared to the 20 million triangles of Metashape and the 3 million triangles of 3ds Zephyr. And to finish this little tour of this model, the back wall from the inside of the barn, pretty well reconstructed, very uniform texture, so I really like that. I'm pretty happy with that part. So in conclusion, for Reality Capture, something that needs to be noted is that it generated a huge amount of vertices and faces, over 70 million faces, but it also did not manage to align all the cameras. In fact, it only aligned 588 out of the 637 cameras, compared to Metashape, which managed to align all the cameras. The texture is pretty good. I believe it's a single 8K texture, and I think it did very well aligning that and populating this with the most relevant bits from the photo that were used as an input. And the last contender of our list, last but not least, Meshroom, the only purely completely free and open source software of the bunch. Now, of course, first thing you notice, the quality isn't the same. Now, one important note here, it's not necessarily the software's fault. It's just that Meshroom globally is much slower than the other three softwares that I just presented. And what happened is that it crashed during the night, and so I had to relaunch it, but because I didn't have that much time, I had to downsample the depth maps by a factor 4 instead of the regular 2 that comes default with the software. So that's why the quality of the mesh is much lower, as you can already tell. Now, a little peculiarity of Meshroom on this case is that it didn't produce a lot of triangles. It actually produced 2.4 million triangles, so that's less than what 3ds Zephyr did. But in terms of textures, it generated a whopping 27 4K textures. Super overkill, and that step alone took about 3 hours, which is more than the 3 other softwares combined to generate everything from camera alignment, mesh generation to mesh texturing. Insanely slow, but the textures look the best, obviously. Now, you have to give credit where it's due. Even though we used a much lower resolution for the depth map, meaning that the resolution of the mesh, the final mesh, is going to be much lower as well, it actually did a pretty good job at reconstructing the object. And here, of course, we see everything back to back, so it's really apparent what the differences are. But if you're just using this, you're going to be very happy with the results, especially if you actually take the time to produce the full resolution mesh, taking 12 hours, maybe 20 hours to produce a very high quality mesh. Now, in my opinion, where the mesh suffered the most for Meshroom is the inside of the roof. The underside of the roof is missing beam elements and it's relatively mushy overall, so this is really where the quality dropped significantly. And it can also be seen here with the planks, where it did not understand that there were two different objects separated by a gap of air, and it kind of merged everything into a mushy mess. So in conclusion for Meshroom, I would say that while the results are quite a bit lower grade in terms of geometry compared to the other three softwares, I think it really deserves credit and really deserves to be on this list because it is on the same level. You can actually get very good results with it. It just takes much longer to process everything. But keep in mind that this is being done by people who are not getting money from it. It's open source, anybody can contribute, and it has been free and will remain free forever for you to use with no restrictions whatsoever. And I think this really deserves credit. So if you want to get into photogrammetry and you're not sure you're gonna like it, just go with Meshroom. It's free, it doesn't engage you to anything, it's relatively lightweight, and it can produce phenomenal results. Now let us quickly just do a recap of the pros and cons of each software and what we can learn from this little comparison. Overall, all four softwares did a really good job at recreating what I captured with the DJI Mini 3 Pro, and the user experience was relatively similar between all softwares. Now, here are a couple differences that I think are noteworthy. So in terms of speed, the three commercial softwares were kind of toe-to-toe. Basically, 3ds Zephyr took about 1 hour 17 minutes to generate everything, from the photos to the final textured mesh. Metashape took around 58 minutes to get its result, and Reality Capture took as well about 1 hour and 10 minutes. So they're very similar in terms of speed. Then you have Meshroom, which is in another league, but not in the right way. It took more than 3 hours and 30 minutes with a quarter scale on the depth map to generate the mesh, and it took 1 hour 30 minutes to texture the mesh. And that is not even taking into account the alignment process that worked very well. It did align almost all cameras, 616 out of 637 cameras, but it took more than an hour to do this. So Meshroom, really slow compared to the other three softwares. Now, speaking of alignment quality, the best software in this regard is Metashape. It aligned all cameras, no problems. Then comes 3ds Zephyr with 628 out of the 637 cameras aligned. In third place, you get Meshroom with 616 cameras, and the least good was Reality Capture, surprisingly, with 588 cameras. Now, what happened here is that it created three different batches. The first and main batch was 588 cameras, so this is the one that I've used to reconstruct the mesh and the one that you've seen in the video, but it also used 21 cameras that were shooting the roof, so one of the two passes that I did over the roof, and considered this to be a separate object for some reason, and I didn't want to go through the process of merging point clouds and whatnot. I just wanted to have like the default click on the button and wait the results approach and experience. So that's why I used just the main batch with the 588 cameras. Now, a third batch was actually created by Reality Capture, but it was all messed up. It was basically some of the pictures of the back wall on the outside of the barn, and it was all curved and absolutely not usable. So even if you tried to merge this, it would have created a worse result than not merging it. Now, another point that is worth mentioning is the quality of the mesh. I already mentioned this a little earlier, but here is a summary of everything. So the most triangles have been generated by Reality Capture with over 70 million triangles, and it just refused to show it because over 40 million, it just refuses to show it to you, and it just displays the point cloud. So I had to downsample it to 20 million triangles so that it would match the density that Metashape generated with about 19.6 million triangles. Then comes 3ds Zephyr with a much lower triangle count with about 3 million triangles, and then you have Meshroom that only generated 2.4 million triangles. Again, Meshroom would have been able to generate at least twice as many with the proper depth map resolution. Then, when it comes to the texture, 3ds Zephyr did a very good job. It used 4 8K textures, and the results I think are very good. It looks very sharp, very detailed, so I really like that. Metashape by default generated 2 8K textures. They look pretty good, but I think they're a little blurry in places. You can tell that you have less resolution to work with compared to 3ds Zephyr. Then Reality Capture generated a single 8K texture, and I think it did a very good job. The result is very good for a single 8K texture. And then you have Meshroom in its own league, as always. It generated a whopping 27 4K textures, providing the best texture yet, but on a mesh that is subpar. Now we can quickly talk about the ease of use. I found all softwares to be relatively easy to use when you don't know anything. It's relatively well guided and you can find a lot of resources on the internet to help you get started. As long as you don't want to tweak the settings, all of them are equally easy to use, I would say. But then reality capture tends to be a bit more confusing when it comes to changing the parameters. It's all tiny and it's all like little boxes in this list, not necessarily super easy to use. And for Meshroom, a similar thing. You click on the node and then you have many parameters. You don't necessarily know what they mean, so you have to look up a documentation or have somebody explain that to you. For 3ds Zephyr and Metashape, there are some presets that you can use that are much easier to understand for beginners, but it also allows you to go deeper into the process and actually tweak stuff yourself. So overall they're pretty good, but I would say that 3ds Zephyr and Metashape did a little better in terms of usability. Now the last point that we're going to compare between all these softwares is the pricing options. Of course, it's going to be something very important when you're going to decide which software you're going to use. So let's start with 3ds Zephyr. It has a limited free version that caps the number of images that you can use as an input to 50, which is pretty decent for small objects. It would clearly be insufficient to model such a big object as the barn that I just did here, or any other kind of building or large area that you would want to map with a drone, for example. But it's free forever to use and you can export whatever you want in whatever quality that you want. Then you have a light version that is priced in Europe at least at 199 euros, and it basically offers you everything that you're going to want to have. And it's a permanent license. You buy it once and you use it forever, and you do have 1 year of free updates. So I think that's pretty good. And then you have the full version, which either is 4,200 euros if you pay it once, or you could also access it for a month for 250 euros. And the full version is going to have things like orthophoto generation and georeferencing of images and 3D models. It's also going to have photo consistency optimization, which tremendously improves the quality of the meshes that get generated. And it's clearly aimed at professionals that are going to be using it every day. Then we come to Metashape. It has a very similar pricing option. You don't have a free version that is going to be usable forever. However, they do offer 30-day free trial of the standard version, which is otherwise sold at $179. So that's very similar to what 3ds Zephyr sells for. And then of course you have the Pro version, which again has orthophoto generation and georeferencing and all these things that you're going to want to use when you're a professional. And that version is sold for $3,500. For reality capture, we have a pricing model that is quite different. So of course you have the Pro version, full version, we're at about $3,750. It's the same ballpark as the other two, really. But you also have a pay per input mode. Now what that means is that when you import photos, you're gonna pay per megapixel of these photos. So if you have imported 10 photos at 10 megapixels each, you're gonna pay for 100 megapixels. But once you have registered these photos, you can export as many things you want as long as it's based on these same photos. So for example, you will be able to export different meshes with different levels of quality, different textures, different algorithms used, and you will not have to pay more than what you already paid when you first registered these photos. So that's a very good point. And if you're going to be using this very seldomly, once every 2 months or something like this, it's probably going to be the cheaper option to get a very good result very fast, but at a relatively cheap cost. So for example, here, the 588 12 megapixel images that were used to create the mesh of the barn, it would cost about $4.50 to register all these. Now, of course, keep in mind that I can just re-export anytime, as many times as I want, without paying a single more dime. And then finally, of course, we have Meshroom. It's free, it's open source. Download it now, use it forever. Simplest model there is. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned something useful. I hope that it was exhaustive. Let me know in the comments below what you think about each software and what experience you have with them. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Don't try to tie me, don't try to fight me, you better run. What you gonna do, what you gonna do, what you gotta do, what you gotta do, la 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 la. Yeah, fellow gentlemen, smooth and subtle, don't need to be
in these fragile times. Got no worries cause I know that we can endure the aftermath. Just gotta stay classy, even when the fog gets a little crazy. Yeah, I'ma be mellow, free flowing like a beach jello. The one who drama back, coming like Othello. Tryna stay above, watching from the stars, Apollo. Get the bed on my system, just wanna let you know I can be soft on the outside, cause I'd rather not have to start fights. But don't be testing my inner patience, you don't wanna cross that.